And some of these programs give the total lie to a lot of what has been said about this period. I mean, the first one was that I was told that the Greek Cypriots appreciated the problems of lack of funding on the Turkish Cypriot side, and where there were ways in which they could do that within the old structure. I was asked to help to deliver funding. So the old village constable and water constable structures, for instance, and the actual village administration structures, despite everything else that had happened in Nicosia, and continued now that we'd reconstituted intercommunal relationships locally, they continued in place, and the government in Cyprus gave me money, which I took. Somebody from an old Turkish Cypriot district officer came out with me and distributed the funds, to the Turkish Cypriot. So there was in fact funding flowing out of the Greek Cypriot exchequer into Turkish Cypriot hands. Then we began to resolve the water movement problems, which were severe because a lot of the water channels had been cut as they flowed through areas where there had been conflict. We began to resolve the problems of grain connection. And we moved towards the point where harvesting, of course, at that time in '64 was absolutely the key to Cypriot economic survival. And of course, now you had all of the land was mixed with the Turkish Cypriots having evacuated many areas, so there was an extraordinarily complicated arrangements had to be made, both to get Turkish Cypriots back to abandoned areas, to deal with areas that were between lines of division, and to actually organise the movement of equipment and harvesting personnel. And that was all done by my patrol, as was the grain collection and the water movement arrangements. And this led us on to the fact that in some of the areas where the harvesting was to take place, there were villages where the Turkish Cypriot property had been absolutely immaculately maintained by the Greek Cypriot villagers. There were others where it had not been maintained at all, well, it had been totally destroyed, but we suggested that in those areas it would not be unthinkable that maybe the Turkish Cypriots moved back into their old homes. And this was taken up quite enthusiastically by Küçük, and eventually, very, very privately, we got an agreement from both communal leaderships that in 3 villages to start with, 3 major villages, the Turkish Cypriots on a sort of trial basis would come back into reoccupy their own homes, use that during the harvesting period, and then, if all went well, they would stay on. It wasn't, of course, just a question of negotiating it with the communal leaderships, and we had to get absolute agreement from everybody at ground level. We had to get absolute agreement from both from TMT and from the more militant paramilitary units on the Greek Cypriot, within the Greek Cypriot community. And people have asked me, why on earth should TMT have agreed to that, and everywhere else they were trying to encourage the separation. And the fact was that basically twofold. One was that the Turkish Cypriots were desperate to go back and realised in a lot of these areas from contacts they'd had in the areas where we'd recreated and taken people back personally, and I used to drive people all the time back in my car to meet the Greek Cypriots again. They realised that there was a life to be lived back there. So Küçük felt very heavy pressure on him, to start to relieve the refugee situation. And these people otherwise were living in refugee camps, either at Mandris or around Fota, and under very unpleasant conditions. So we're now into mid-May of 1964, and we have a situation where there's a sort of private agreement within both communities to start a process that in fact means reintegration. And that has arrived through an extremely intense bottom-up process, starting from the most minor and simple of relationships in every single village of the northern areas of Cyprus. In order to implement this, we needed two other things. One was an escorts policy, because it was one of the worst sides of affairs in Cyprus at that time, that hostage-taking had continued on the roads. I mean, it tended to be independent groups or independent extremists who thought that they were eliminating extremists within the other community. But nevertheless, it was intensely damaging. It was completely against Packard's policy. He got very upset every time he heard about hostage-taking. From March on, usually, I was able to find out what happened to the hostages and get them released again, so they were not continuing to be executed as has happened sometimes in the early days. But nevertheless, in order to regenerate a total normality of life, one had to at least start with an escorts policy so that Turkish Cypriots could feel that they were safe in their movements, and that Greek Cypriot people could feel they were safe in moving through Turkish controlled areas, or areas controlled by the Turkish army. And I finally got an agreement on that, having been asking for it continually since early January, and about the 15th of May. So the 6th of June, we were in the final stage of preparation for the move back of these villagers. On the 6th of June, unfortunately, a British major called Major Macy disappeared. On the 8th of June, I submitted the request for special escort arrangements to be made and special policing arrangements to be made for these villages. I submitted that to the military headquarters. Prior to that, I'd simply been working through the UN mediating teams. Submitted it, went home. A couple of hours later, a couple of motorcyclists arrived and said, "You're under arrest." So I was then called in by General Young. He said, General Carver. He said, "I'm doing the following things." He said, "I'm dismantling the escort arrangements, I'm dismantling the mediating arrangements, and you're to be flown out of Cyprus tomorrow." And General Carver, unfortunately, was not the sort of guy that you could plead with or argue with. Makarios asked that I stay, Kuchuk asked that I stay, the United Nations asked that I could stay, but next morning, sure enough, I reported at the airport, and completely, without any insignia on it, a CIA plane flew in. I was the only cargo in it. I was strapped into a single seat in the cargo hold and flown out and dumped in the American airbase Hellinikon in Greece. And that was the end of my time there. I had a continuing interface because I was asked to go back by Makarios and by Pavlovs and by Kuchuk, to talk to them, because essentially they'd come to depend very much on the reporting and the daily information I'd given them. And then I was asked by Makarios to provide him with a back channel to London, because he didn't trust the diplomatic routes that the British were offering him. I was also asked by the Greek government to provide a back channel to London for a much worse reason, unfortunately, that the Americans had agreed with the Athens government. This was in late October 1964. So I was told by the Athens government that it was necessary to remove Makarios for the good of NATO, and therefore Greece was preparing to do that with the support of the Americans, and they wanted the green light from London. They said they would not move without that green light from London. I was being asked to go to London, see the right people and get the green light, which was singularly not the sort of thing I wanted to do.